We'll move on to our third speaker, Janine Juggins from Unilever and the CBI Tax Committee.
Thank you. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to present to such a distinguished audience here today, and I am making these comments in a personal capacity. So I've been working for companies in the area of international tax for more than a life sentence. And I can honestly say that the last 6 years have seen some of the most exciting and encouraging developments in the world of international tax. Now, I'm going to use some slides today that I used from a presentation made at an IFA London tax meeting in March 2014. I also had the daunting task of following Pascal as a speaker at that meeting. And using old slides, of course, saves me a lot of time. But that's not the only reason for using them today, because I want to test what progress has been made and what we can learn from our experiences. Here we are, a full 5 years later. I've put on weight and become a grandmother. Prime ministers have come and gone, and it's worth spending a few moments to pause and reflect on where we've come from and where we're going to. So let's see what was on our minds 5 years ago. So then, as now, I would wager that the number one concern of most company tax directors is waking up to find that their company is on the front page of the newspaper or e-equivalent and the story is related to a tax issue. At this point, you've got the corporate equivalent of an exploding bomb to deal with, whether it's merited or not. The second thing you worry about is that there'll be a large and unexpected tax issue that either has a large cash tax impact, tying up working capital, or a large earnings impact in terms of the tax charge in the financial statements, or both. And these are not generally cases where there's been an error. Large corporates have qualified experts, they have rigorous processes and controls in place to manage that risk. This is more likely to be due to an unexpected tax authority challenge or a retrospective change in tax law. So how can OECD BEPS help? And please bear in mind that what follows was also said 5 years ago. So it's been said many times before, but business really does value certainty. If you think back to the previous slide and the things that tax directors worry about, the common theme you see is that of the unexpected. All successful companies rely on being able to manage risk. And the penalties for not doing this well or being perceived as not doing this well can be severe. Therefore, to the extent that the OECD now can deliver more certainty for business, this would be very positive. Of course, the opposite is also true. More uncertainty would be very unwelcome. And business is very pragmatic. It has been and still is very difficult for businesses to counter the media coverage of multinational tax practices effectively. Tax is complex, and finding the sound bites with the same impact as the ones we've all seen in the media, for example, which compare gross revenues to cash taxes paid, is a real challenge. And it's very good that many businesses now are saying more about their approach to managing tax. Some companies have made quantitative as well as qualitative disclosures, but it's almost an impossible task to do this in a way that the average person would be able to conclude that the result is fair. The challenges are twofold: the complexity of the international tax system on the one hand, and the subjectivity that comes with differing perceptions of fairness. And in that sense, the OECD work has been helpful. It calmed the situation. The 15 actions brought time for a more thoughtful response and brought the focus back to solutions and away from rhetoric. And it's clear that each country's fiscal position will be impacted differently by changes in the international tax framework. You need only to think about countries which both receive foreign investment and make foreign investments to understand how complicated this is for governments as well as for businesses. And there's no doubt that the timetable, back then as now, is ambitious. But too long a timetable would most likely not meet the public expectation for action, nor the electoral horizon of most politicians. But this is also an opportunity to make some improvements that will benefit both tax authorities and taxpayers, as we all have finite resources operating under budget constraints, etc. So there's mutual interest in doing things more efficiently. However, it's clear that there were some fundamental issues at the heart of BEPS that were not being answered. In one sense, this is no big surprise because they're very difficult questions. But on the other hand, if they're not properly addressed, the concern is that the eventual international tax reform may not deliver what the public, tax authorities and taxpayers alike expect them to deliver. The G20 communiqué issued on the 23rd of February 2014 stated, "Profits should be taxed where economic activities deriving the profits are performed and where value is created." You can be sure that this sentence was carefully pored over before each G20 country agreed to the communiqué, and on the face of it seems a pretty reasonable statement. However, let's take a practical example, such as an R&D centre in India, as an example country. It has many employees carrying out contract R&D on a cost-plus basis, funded and controlled by an R&D team of the foreign parent. As a result, it is the foreign parent who bears all the risk of failures and the rewards of success, a situation that's not too dissimilar to many third-party arrangements. India will most likely not have the same view of value creation as the country of the foreign parent. Both countries can agree in principle to the idea that taxing rights follow value creation, but they have different views of what created value. Now we have Pillar 1 departing to some extent from the arm's length principle. Will it also depart from the concept of value creation? This also highlights another fundamental issue, which is the different relative weights attached by some countries to the role of labour versus the role of capital. As a business, you need access to both financial and human resources. You also need the infrastructure that supports business, such as transportation, access to power, broadband, etc. Depending on where a country is in terms of its stage of development, and depending on the degree to which access to finance and infrastructure is controlled by the state, depending on the size and cost of the labour pool, it's easy to see that one country may give different weight to the importance of labour versus the importance of capital, compared with the view of another country. These are deep, fundamental and structural differences with both economic and ideological roots, and this is part of the reason why the current division of taxing rights between source and residence countries is being questioned also under Pillar 1. Thirdly, countries are not all the same. They don't have the same natural resource endowment, the same access to major transport routes, the same demographics, to mention but a few things. They are not at the same stages of development. There is simply not a level playing field in that sense. So where does one draw the line between a sovereign right to set tax policy which supports the needs of a specific country's citizens and which underpins economic growth on the one hand, and harmful tax practices on the other? Are we to assume that all tax incentives are bad? Should wealthier countries be saying to a country that has no obvious natural advantages, or a country that is at an earlier stage of its development or in a remote location, that it has no right to implement tax policies that encourage economic investment? Or should we think about this more in terms of a duty of care, a country considering the impact that its tax policies will have on its near neighbours or on lesser developed countries? If so, how can this be evaluated in practice? Should the emphasis instead be on good governance, a transparent assessment of whether the tax policy in question has delivered sustainable net benefits for a country's citizens? Sustainable is the key word here, as it requires continued success over a period of time and not just a fleeting advantage. Remember, these comments were made 5 years ago. Fast forward to today, and these concerns are just as live for the Pillar 2 minimum tax proposal. Let's make sure that we are all clear on the policy reasons that sit behind Pillar 2. Otherwise, how will we assess whether the design is fit for purpose? And finally, the express target of BEPS was double non-taxation. And clearly, if some tax revenues that are that were currently escaping tax are brought back within the tax net of a specific country, then tax revenues will be increased. However, many cross-border transactions do not involve tax havens, and therefore changes in the tax treatment will at best result in tax revenues being shifted between countries, and at worst, expose the multinational taxpayer to double tax jeopardy. Bringing this to the present day, Pillar 1 looks to change the allocation of existing taxing rights between countries and to create new taxing rights for others. Then as now, there's a need to be crystal clear in managing country and the public's expectations on the impact to tax revenues. I also identified some mutual BEPS opportunities, and I say mutual because they should benefit taxpayer and tax authority alike. Tax compliance is an important responsibility. It's essential to get it right, but as a process, it really doesn't deliver any value to a business, and businesses in general act as unpaid tax collectors for a whole host of other taxes. We're happy to do that because responsible tax compliance is a fundamental part of a business's obligation to society so that it has a license to operate. Therefore, business is motivated to make tax compliance as efficient and cost-effective as possible. And international tax reform provides a unique opportunity to standardise tax compliance, to make it less complex, and to support a targeted, risk-based approach to tax audit. If instead, as under some of the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 proposals, we end up with significant supplementary complexity, we will have squandered this opportunity. Moreover, more information will not be a solution if the underlying issue is that the tax authority doesn't like the result. Effective risk assessment is a further mutual opportunity. Less time taken to conduct and conclude tax audits ties up less resources for both. And this works best where there's a cooperative, transparent relationship between the taxpayer and the tax authority, where the shared aim of both is to collect the right amount of tax due under the law. It won't work, therefore, where the taxpayer has the aim of paying less tax than is due under the law, nor where the tax authority has arbitrary tax collection targets to meet. And it will also not work where the performance incentives are not aligned with the principle of the right amount of tax, where, for example, a tax auditor's pay is referenced to the amount of tax assessments raised, regardless of whether they are ultimately sustained or not. And I'm not making this up, this really does happen. So one off-quoted aim of BEPS is to eliminate unintended double non-taxation. In other words, to ensure that all income is subject to tax somewhere. And I've used the word unintended because this is a difficult question in practice because of the issue of sovereign tax policy that I referred to earlier. For example, some tax authorities would view a foreign parent operating under a territorial system as leaving money on the table that they are then entitled to go after. However, more focus on low taxed income should enable the tax audit to focus on the highest risk areas. This may mean that Pillar 2 is not required. And finally, a more effective tax dispute resolution process is needed to help make the best use of limited taxpayer and authority resources. This was badly needed then and badly needed today. We all recognise that the BEPS timetable was ambitious and the digital agenda equally so. If there's a lack of real consensus, there's a risk that the timetable will be met through using unclear wording that allows for different interpretations, or by the deliberate inclusion of alternative treatments, paving the way for more disputes in the future. We cannot let this happen. The quid pro quo for fundamental international tax reform must be a structured, time-limited path to certainty of no double taxation. Taxpayers, governments and the OECD need to remain focused on this outcome, as the success of digital reform will be measured not only in terms of delivering these action points on time, but also whether it delivers an enduring, sustainable, reformed international tax framework for future generations. So, history can be very instructive, so thank you for bearing with me. We've got to the end of the old slides now. We have Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, complementary proposals that we all hope will ensure there's no need for a BEPS 2.0. And for that to be the case, what needs to be held true? Firstly, we all recognise that this is a political process in response to public concerns and the need of tax administrations to stabilise the tax base as the economy globalises and evolves in the digital era. If public concerns are to be addressed, any solution will need to be easy to explain and perceived as fair by the majority, and it would likely need to be based on widely publicly available information that can be accessed by the public. There are some obvious trade-offs here. For example, the simpler the model, the less capacity there is to provide for different treatment for special circumstances. And from the business perspective, multinational income should only be taxed once, and if the taxation is to be of profits and not gross receipts, there needs to be a deduction for all business expenses. If the tax is to be collected in a simplified way, such as using a withholding tax, then it needs to be creditable or refundable. The current corporate tax system is part of a framework that includes policy choices on how to tax capital as distinct from income. If the taxing rights over income are altered, then consistent changes are required for the taxation of capital. You can't remove one leg of the chair and still expect to have a stable, comfortable seat. The same is true for withholding taxes. Today, these operate to give taxing rights to countries which are the source of the income. If more of the global income is to be distributed to source countries under the proposed international tax reforms, why do you still need these kinds of withholding taxes on dividends, interest, royalties, services in addition? Global businesses compete, so the international tax system should not contribute to an unlevel playing field or create incentives for global businesses to change their commercial operating model. And there are two sides to this. On the one side, the tax system shouldn't include incentives to restructure to reduce a single level of taxation, and it shouldn't require businesses to restructure so that they don't get double taxed. And of course, we all recognise that business models constantly evolve. Therefore, the new system needs to be sufficiently flexible in order to support this. Sounds simple, doesn't it? There are significant challenges for countries. To be workable in practice, what is on the table requires a move away from bilateral to multilateral approaches. And this means that some surrender of country tax sovereignty will be required if multiple levels of taxation are to be avoided. We will potentially need one agreed pool of net taxable income and a single forum for the resolution of tax disputes. It's difficult to see how the Pillar 2 minimum tax proposal could coexist with both full inclusion and territorial tax systems, and this may therefore require a move to a more common global approach. And finally, all countries will need to be able to deliver the political agreement to implement the international tax reform. This last point is perhaps the most important of all. This time, we cannot present this as an exercise in countering multinational tax avoidance. When you do this, you perpetuate public mistrust in the tax system and in business. This is the opposite of what we have a collective interest in trying to achieve. This time, we must create an international tax system that can both allow business to flourish and grow the tax base, and that the voting public can recognise as being fair and equitable. This, supported by responsible business behaviour, is the only way forward to successfully rebuild public trust. And of course, to avoid you having to look at the same slides in 5 years' time all over again. Thank you.